Hi everyone, it's Kevin here again, and this week we're going to be covering debugging. So, debugging is huge in computer programming and software development. The reason it's so big is because typically when you enter into a new organization to write some code, you're not going to be creating new stuff. Of course, there's always the exception. There's always that one individual that goes and starts working for a startup, or they create their own application that goes good for them. And good, and I hope that happens. I hope that people go out there and innovate and create new stuff. However, for the vast majority of people that go into this field, they have to work on, or not have to, but they choose to work at companies where there's already existing systems. So there might be already an application that they're working on. So if you think, say you go to work for Facebook or for Google or any of those big companies, they already have these products that are out there, and these products continuously need to be maintained. It's what's known as a software development lifecycle, and this is covered in other courses like systems analysis. But for the purpose of this course, it's we're going to cover the debugging aspect, because there's an area with the software development lifecycle stage, I think is the proper term, where you're making it better, right? You're fixing anything that's wrong with it. So, for example, say you work for ABC company that handles transactions. They sell some product of any type, and this product needs to be stored in a database. And we need to make some updates to this product. If the users are already using the application and they report that, hey, a payment isn't going through, or anything like that, a login isn't working properly, payment comes through but the receipt comes back weird, like something's off. So these are things that have to be fixed. And of course, we're covering the UI side of the mobile app development. The API side of it's covered in another course, of course, but it's relevant for both. It's relevant for any sort of software development, because when we go and debug, typically many people are used to working on something. They get this far. So there's this function handle button press, and they want to know whether or not let's see here, right here, this item even has anything. So we're checking to see if this item that is stored in global items, it's a list of type item. This user, for example, or this developer, for example, wants to see if there's anything in here. Of course, they might get a message that something's null down here, but maybe something was assigned to it that made it become null. Maybe it was assigned to at this point, but once we get down there, it's not. Now it's something else. So what you might see is somebody doing print item dot whatever. So like ID, for example, and they get this far, and it's like, oh, cool, right? So the item.id has a value at this point. Or they might do something like got here, right? Because they got to this point, and that works all right. It's just that the console is so limiting. It limits you to it's not that it's not useful, right? It has its uses, of course, and a good developer makes use of that console of the terminal. At least in this case, that's the right terminology here, the terminal. However, when it comes to working in some really nested hierarchies and some nested methods or functions inside of classes, it can become quite problematic to pinpoint exactly where the problem is. So to demonstrate this, I'll actually show off how to get this started. So if you want to debug, in case you haven't already started, because I know that I've covered it a tiny bit so far in the course, but if you don't know how to, you got to go into here, run and debug. You got to make sure that your virtual device is running, and you need to make sure that via running Flutter devices that it's available here. So you can see it right here, emulator 5554. Now, there is the option to do Flutter run -d and then the device name. So that's something that many people have been doing, and that works fine for running it from the terminal. But if you want to debug, you would go up here and select your configuration. Now, typically you can just click on here and it'll upload it right to the device. It'll know right away. Sometimes, though, it might launch a window, and that means that it's not recognizing that the device is there, or it's purposefully launching to the window because maybe one of the configurations is set to launch it to the window. So most of the time, though, you can just click on here, and if you can't, you gotta open up your configurations and select it, basically. And it looks like it's not running anymore because it's uploading. As you can see, the status down here, it's launching. So we're back to the last application that was installed on this device. I'm going to give it a little bit of time here so I can install. If it takes too long, I'll just pause the video. But alright, perfect. It's it launched already. So this is a very similar app to what was made last week. Actually, it's the exact same app. I just made a few modifications. So I haven't even modified this yet. Make that week 8 right there. And there we go. We go ahead and save. It should update via the hot reload. So that's one nice thing. So you don't have to go down here and type in R, lowercase r or capital R. You just save. So if you make a change here, if you delete this and it's going to cause a syntax error, it's not going to build. But if you do this, if you make a change, it'll tell you that it's reloading. So you do have access to debug console here and output as well. Just so you know, but I guess we can keep an eye on the debug console in case we do need to print anything to the screen. I don't think I do in this application at all. But I have made a few changes here. So when we go to the edit item page, if I F12 into that, that's another big thing, by the way. I know it's not directly related to debugging, but if you don't take advantage of that, you should start taking advantage of that where you can F12 into something. So you could also right click and select go to definition. That works as well. But typically it's set up where if you hit F12, and if you don't have the F12 key on your PC or on your laptop or whatever, you can hit the function key and then at the same time hit F12. It'll take you right to where whatever you clicked on is defined. So if we click on here, we F12 into it. Oh, the definition is right here. You can try F12ing into these libraries or into these outside items that we work with, and yeah, it'll actually show you the actual logic that's being executed. So here's some of the controller logic, or if we F12 into like the scaffold, we can see some of the logic with that. Not often are you going to be working with that, but know that it's available if you want to work with it. So, but back to this though, I did make some changes. So if you can tell here, I added a few fields. So if I go back to the item.dart definition, we have a royalty and we have a price. This is not supposed to be representative of an actual organization. In this case, I just modeled it after some item that you have set to some price that you're going to sell, and perhaps that item is you have some licensing, right? So you licensed it from some company that holds the copyright or the patent or whatever, and you have to pay them some royalty. And depending on how much the item sells for, you got to sell them a differing royalty. So that royalty is going to change as that price changes. So that's a little bit of logic in reality if you think about it, because depending on the price, we're going to have to set different percentages to multiply the price by, and then that's what the royalty is going to be. So if we look here, there's no royalty calculation. If I go back to this main.dart page, I have a ternary operator. I check to see if the royalty is greater than 0, and if it is, we display the royalty, and we do a toString as fixed, where all we're doing is we're just limiting it to 2 decimal points, just for formatting purposes. If we don't have that, it's going to look pretty icky. And if we don't, we just say no royalty calculation. So that's exactly what's going on here. Now, you can try to do UI debugging. It's not really something that's done. Basically, if the UI is junk, the UI is junk. If it's not working right, something's not set up right, it'll give you a build error. But something like having it attached to the wrong function. So if you have a couple button press functions, you just copied one elevated button from another area and paste it into your new area, and you hit a button and it's not doing anything, or maybe it's doing something that you don't expect it to do, well, you can always click on it, F12 into it, and see what it's doing. Or you could set a breakpoint, and that's really the first big concept, the breakpoint. So if we click on edit item, I know that I've showed this off before very briefly, but you once you set a breakpoint, which can be done just by clicking on this side right here, and this works for a lot of programming languages. This works for so if I open up Thonny right here, Python Pro, it's a Python IDE. It's a beginner's Python IDE, but it's really good for rapid development of stuff. It's easy to install. It comes with like a Raspberry Pi. So like for example, this program of calculating electricity prices, we can set breakpoints in this thing and hit debug, and we can go step by step. So we're into here, and of course I'm going to go a little bit over what each one of these are, the step into, step over, but just to kind of show off how that works. Okay, there we go. So you double click, that's how you set it. So each one's going to be a little bit different, but if we click on here, enter some stuff here, that's a little bit more reasonable. 14 cents per kilowatt hour. I made this quite a long time ago. Electricity for the device, 1400 watts. Days, and there we go. We hit that breakpoint right there. So if we go and step over here, just continue going through the code. Of course, this isn't a Python IDE or a Thonny IDE instructional video. It's a Flutter with VS Code instructional video. But I just wanted to show that the ideas kind of carry over to other integrated development environments. So again, same thing here. We can analyze some of the stuff. So for example, one thing we can check out, we can check out the value of some local and global variables. So if we go here, we have access to our variables. So if we look at this here, we have some variables that we can look into. So for example, we have item. So item, and we can see the properties of item. So this is really useful for when you're looking into a little block of code that you're not too familiar with, and you know that you're expecting something at some point because a condition's referencing it. So for example, we're expecting ID here, but we don't know what the other properties are. But by looking at our locals, we can see what exactly is inside of that, like what we're iterating through. Another thing we can do that's very useful is just hovering. So if we hover over item, for example, we can see item right here. Something else that we can do sometimes, depends. So this example, we can't modify it outright. But in other instances, let me show an example here. So we have a new string here. Okay. One second, I'll get this to work here. I apologize. I was just trying to assign, or I was trying to print something outside of a method, as the error message stated explicitly. So it's not going to let you do that because it's not inside of a method. So if we go inside of here, try to print it there, set a breakpoint in here. We hit this breakpoint. Is it going to let me in this case? It won't let you in this case. Visual Studio, the full IDE, you can hover over and modify values. That's an amazing thing that you can do with it. Also, you have the access to the immediate window. I suppose in this case it's not letting me do it, so we're not going to worry about that at this point. But if you're working with another IDE, you can modify values as you're going through. But that is something that I really did want to mention because that's something that's quite useful in a lot of other IDEs. So let's continue here. If we are looking over and let's go back to that example, we have a value here, but then the value changes. So we could set a breakpoint right here to see if we even enter this condition. Select that button and save as well. Let it do its hot reload. And sometimes there are issues if you make too many changes. So I got rid of a variable. What we can do is just stop and then start again. If that ever does happen, which it can happen, especially with the full version of Visual Studio, the entire, like Visual Studio 2022 or whatever the newest version is, you can, if you make too many changes, it'll basically tell you. In this case, I guess, gave us that little error in the debug console. So I'll let this attach and I'll come back when it's good to go. So if you run into an issue where it's not launching, if you run into an issue where it's like not able to connect, just press and hold here and then restart. That's all you got to do. Just in case you run into that. That's something that I just ran into and took a little bit to figure it out. Just a quick Google search. But anyways, if we go into here and we restarted the application after making some significant code changes, and we select whatever event, we fire up some events to go into some function, notice that we enter the condition. So for example, here we know that this condition was met. So there is some element in items that matches the ID that we have stored, which is 1. So if I hover right over that ID, it shows up as 1. If we hover over the ID here of item, it's not actually, because we're not actively using it inside of this here block of code. But so at that point, we can do what's known as a step over. You can also do an F10. It'll continue going through each one of these blocks. So this is kind of I wouldn't call it a chained call, but we have some global, and we're accessing some property of that global, which is items, and then we're calling some function add, which is going to add something into that global. So that can be kind of difficult to debug. It's not the best to do. I mean, in this case, it's the reason that it's not always the best is because if you have some, like for example, global items, we have something defined in here, and global items, say, makes a call to some other function inside of another class. So some other class dot whatever, multiple things, multiple chained calls, that can become kind of difficult to debug. It's just kind of a rule of thumb. So it's one thing to keep in mind. But notice how when we step over, we move right onto the next line. Sometimes it'll do that. Sometimes if you throw an exception, it'll break right out of it. So that's something to keep in mind. Then we have what's known as a step into, and that's where I'm going to show off some of that logic that I wrote for the royalty calculation. So if we go into the edit item.dart page here, I added some additional logic in the update item pressed function. So if I set a breakpoint in here and I select the edit item option, I update the price here to, let's say, $100. Select update item, we're going to jump into here. So as of right now, current item should be null. It's not going to show us anything because there's nothing into it. There's nothing inside of it. And we now have a value because all the values are present here. We start making some changes to the global variable that we're accessing, our pseudo persistence, quote unquote. And we can also hover over some of these other properties and we can see what the values are inside of those. So for example, we have 100 here, right? So one bug that you might encounter is if you use a try parse and you're passing in the right stuff, or you think you're passing in the right stuff, but the value is being assigned always to 0 or to some default value. In this case, I basically say, hey, if the output is null, let's see if we can hover over that. It's not going to give us any documentation while we're debugging. It doesn't look like, but if the output's null, it's going to assign that to price, but price isn't nullable. So if we go into tax calculation, we're not in here, I'm sorry. If we, inside of current item, class item, price can't be null. So it would have to look like that for it to be null. But since it isn't, though, we have to assign a default value if it is null. So if you're working through this, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm going to skip out of this. We see our updated value, edit the item again, and say I do ABC here. This is junk data that's coming in, and we set a breakpoint right here. We update the item, and as of right now, the price should be 100, which is what it was when it came in. And then we have this try parse happening with 100 ABC, and we're going to see what happens here. 0.0 because we assign a default of 0 if this try parse fails. So if we jump past all this stuff, we go back, we see a value of 0, even though we think we thought we entered some valid value in there. Well, it's a pretty nice way to quickly determine what's going on. So let's go into let's try to do some of the step into functionality here. So we create a new instance of text calculation, which is a class. If we step into here, all it does is it's just essentially a repository for one function, and this function is calculate item royalty, and it takes in an instance of item basically, and we just check the price of the item, and depending on the price we assign a different percentage. And then in here this is supposed to be a bug, right? But we have some other logic here, which if it's not 0, we set it to 0, which we don't want. In this case, this is not what we would want, but we're going to detect that by debugging, obviously. If we're looking at the code, we can tell, hey, you know, that's the case. But again, with larger code bases, if you're working with several files that you're jumping between, that could become problematic. So we're going to go ahead and set a breakpoint in here, and we're going to try to replicate the error. So for example, say a user said, hey, the item calculation is not coming through properly, so we're going to set our item price here to $30. Update the item, skip past that, and hey, look, it's true. I mean, there's no value. No value came back because remember we have that turn area in place, and if it's 0, if the value of item.royalty is 0, we display this here block of text. So we're going to try to debug it now. So what are the potential places where royalty is calculated? Well, there's only one. It's calculate item royalty. So we could set a breakpoint in here, select edit item, and make a change to the price. So let's say $20. Update item, and then we can do a step into. And it brings us right into that function that we defined outside of that class that we called it. So remember, we were inside of edit item right here, and by stepping into it brought us into this here function, which we can F12 into as well. We can step over and just look at the values. So for example, at this point, item has a value, or item.price has a value of 20, which is good. That's what we would expect. And we keep going. This all looks good. All right, we assigned a value of 20% to the royalty percent. And we check here, hey, if the royalty percent is not equal to 0, which it's not, we're going to assign it to 0, which we do. We step right into that. Notice how we stepped over all of these because none of these conditions were true. Step over that, and looks like we just return the price multiplied by the royalty percent. Well, that makes perfect sense why the royalty percent would be 0. If we keep stepping over, we should get back. And here we are. Royalty is assigned a value of 0. Step over, and we pop the view from the modal stack. So it's pretty, again, this is a pretty, it's not a super good example because, again, it's not a huge code base, but this is something that you might run into. And it's an area where, yeah, the debugging would work phenomenal. Instead of having prints, like print statements everywhere, you can just debug. So it's like, oh yeah, hey, we found that at this point we set it to 0. So if we get rid of this, save it, let it reload, try to do a royalty calculation again. Okay, there we go. So that's proper, right? Or maybe they say, hey, the calculation of something is not correct. So we're going to go in and we're going to figure out what's going on. We can use debugging for that. So other than that, though, that's about it. That's about the functionality that's included with Visual Studio Visual Studio Code, VS Code, some people call it. So it's not super. It's not a ton of functionality, but it's usable. So it really can help it can really help you if you're working on any bugs that you can't get sorted out. Logical errors is another name for a bug. It's a little funny story with the term bug. So long time ago at some big server, there was they had a big computer that used, I believe, vacuum tubes or something like that, or a relay. It was something like that. I can't say mechanical, right, because a vacuum tube's not mechanical, but it was some sort of device where interference from a creature, like something going into it, would cause problems. So if you have like an animal stepping over an IC, an integrated circuit, that's not going to be a problem, more than likely, as long as they're not like leaving anything on it. But in this case, literally a bug, went into one of these devices, one component of this big computer, and it was recorded. They said, hey, what was wrong? And they had to log the problem, and it was logged as a bug because there was literally a bug inside of the device, the computer. So they say that's where the term bug came from. That was pretty interesting to me when I found out about that. But if you ever wondered where bug came from, But again, another name for it is logical error. So yeah, that's about the extent of it. Of course, I could open up Visual Studio and demonstrate the immediate window and changing the values, and of course your locals, that's big, changing the values inside of the locals and the globals area, but it's been pretty well demonstrated here, and we're not using Visual Studio for this course, so I'm not going to demonstrate it. So that's about all. It's pretty short video here. Not really going to cover anything else, so thanks for watching.